This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's MINERALWARE.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to talk about strategic portfolio management and when and how to sell mineral rights for diversification or if you need some cash flow. And Justin, before we hit record, we were talking about the different scenarios and different types of properties and, what might make sense to sell versus what might not make sense to sell and the timing of all of that. And, if I help clients, and just a little bit of background as to why I was thinking about this as a potential show topic, was I have clients that I work with that are mineral owners. And as part of the advisory services part of my consulting practice, I help them sell minerals. And so that means putting together the marketing presentations, contacting the end buyers that I know that are reputable in that area, soliciting bids, helping them negotiate, and then eventually close the sale. And, I have a couple of clients that are in this situation where whether it's just, hey, I want to simplify my estate, or I am very heavily weighted on oil and gas properties, and we need to diversify to generate some more stable income that's not dependent on oil and gas prices. And there's a lot of reasons why you might consider selling, Justin. And, this was, I think, kind of a timely one for me.
Yeah, no, you said, and it's a topic that comes up again and again. This is something that it's kind of its own beast and its own problem to face with its own challenges when it comes to minerals. And as you said, Matt, there's reasons in life that this may make a lot of sense, and thankfully they're many times real property. And so you're able to use some of the mechanisms that are out there to diversify. And Matt, one of the things that can be a little bit tricky with minerals is our first instinct is to always try to keep the top producing properties and, look at selling some of the non-producing or maybe some that are in different areas. And just like a house in Beverly Hills versus a house in a small town in Alabama, there's a lot of factors that go into what that property might be worth. And Matt, understanding when to sell, it's also understanding when you're going to make an investment into getting properties evaluated, knowing what the value is worth. And Matt, that's kind of, what your clients are coming to you for is, let's figure this out. I would like to use this or do this, and I need a value for the property. And what are some of the considerations, mineral specific, when you're trying to understand when it makes sense to diversify and when, it's time to put this money into it, time to do the research and time to find buyers?
Yeah, there's, I would say, kind of a couple of different situations we'll talk about. And one of them is maybe you have a large mineral portfolio that is worth a lot of money, but the cash flow from that portfolio has dropped significantly. The wells that were drilled several years ago have depleted and declined enough to where that royalty income isn't meeting your needs right now. And you have this large portfolio that you want to tap into to generate some near-term cash flow to help with living expenses, to help with whatever, situation that you're looking at that maybe needing a cash injection. In that situation, it's more of a diversification play. I would say that, in that case, maybe you've talked to your financial advisor, they've decided and helped you decide that you need to sell a little bit of your mineral portfolio down in order to diversify that portfolio to get into maybe buying a rental property, for example. And we'll talk about the different tax strategies and certainly before we get into too far into this, we'll have to throw out the disclaimer that we are not financial, tax, or legal advisors. So do not consider this legal advice or investment advice or tax advice. Certainly consult with your team to get advice specific to your situation. But we'll give you sort of some general considerations, from my consulting practice and working with clients, things that they've come to me and asked about or dealt with, and things that you could consider as you're talking to those advisors. But, I think that diversification concept is one reason why you might consider selling. Another one is that you might need cash flow for some specific need. Maybe it's a medical procedure. Maybe there's some, maybe you want to gift, help your kids buy a house, or you want to buy an investment property. And, again, it just depends on the specific needs and the timing, because there's an ideal time, I would say, to sell, and there's maybe a non-ideal time to sell. And we'll talk about what those might be. And then just ultimately, what we want to give you is a toolkit that you can look at your portfolio and hopefully identify the potential properties that might make the best candidates for a sale if you are considering this or you're going down this path. Because it may not be the obvious answer, like you just mentioned, Justin. It's not the one that was just drilled and or the one that's not producing and you want to get rid of that. You want to keep the one that's producing. Well, maybe there's a reason why you might want to flip that logic. You
said it, Matt. And, as a mineral owner, it's really our job to be informed on what our options are and what our rights are with the property, and then also what benefits we might have. And so having a conversation with your financial advisor, you may realize that there is this, gap that you need to fill, but you should mention that this is real property. Well, I believe this is real property. I believe I could do a 1031. That'll help your financial advisor if you understand kind of the things that most people might not know about it. That'll let you have that conversation a lot better. And Matt, when it comes to identifying, peak value for people that have been around minerals, there's some certain areas that okay, this is probably going to be pretty easy to sell. This is, highly coveted. There's properties that are producing and aren't producing. That affects value. And then what might happen in the near future also affects the value. And what is it that, you're really looking at, especially as a mineral owner, because you're not doing that evaluation yourself? What are the kind of the KPIs or the metrics that you're looking at that say, okay, this might be the time to really look into selling this? Yeah,
I'll just start out. The general category of properties that I would say that are at peak value in their life cycle is a property that has just had wells drilled or maybe recently completed, and you just started receiving royalty payments. And, ideally it would be a property that has multiple horizontal wells going through it, and that peak royalty payment has just hit your bank account. And the reason for that is because there is an easier process for underwriting those types of properties. It's less speculative for a potential buyer. They're looking at as a trading. It's like buying an annuity, basically. They're trading a lump sum of cash today for a stream of future royalty payments, which they can model fairly accurately, depending on which basin it is, assuming it's in an established basin, established formations that we know how to model and forecast. And in that scenario, you need that influx of cash, or maybe you want to exchange that declining and depleting royalty stream for a more steady or more stable income stream from a rental property, for example. In that case, like Justin alluded to, you could do a 1031 exchange from your mineral rights into a rental property, which is another form of real property. And again, you'd have to get with your attorney, get with an advisor to help you with that whole 1031 exchange strategy. And we'll link in the show notes to the episode that where we interviewed Bob Howard with a company that does that specifically and helps people invest in mineral rights as part of a 1031 exchange. So it's kind of going the other way, but he talks through the whole process and the different things like qualified intermediaries and who they are, why you need them, all of that. But that could be a good example where that value, strategically, that asset is at the peak value because it's just had those wells drilled. It's fully developed. There's not really any indication that additional wells are going to get drilled. So ultimately, that value is going to be at its maximum at that point in time. So that could be, a clear candidate for selling. On the other hand, you might have assets that are in basins that are maybe a little tougher to evaluate. So example, let's say you have properties in the Scoop and Stack in Oklahoma. So that's kind of the Anadarko Basin. That kind of is more hit or miss as to where the well performance is going to be really good, or maybe it's going to be average. Even though you might have some wells permitted, companies that are looking at that, maybe it's going to be like, well, I'm not quite sure what the well performance is going to be. I'm not going to be able to offer peak value. So the value per acre for those properties that have a couple of wells recently permitted may not be as high as that non-producing property in the Permian Basin, surprisingly, just because of the upside potential. The well spacing in that Anadarko Basin example, maybe there's only one or two wells that are likely to be drilled versus the Permian example. Maybe there's 20 or 30 horizontal wells that are all going to be producing like gangbusters. In that case, that's going to be very valuable property, even if there aren't wells that are permitted right now. So you have to kind of look at the bigger picture, see, is it timing wise, is it really good? Or geographically, is this property in a highly desirable area to where I could go to market now, and even without having leased that property or having any wells that are permitted, it's nearby where there's horizontal drilling going on, and that is going to be highly desirable for companies that are building a portfolio in that basin. And maybe they need a mix of things that'll come to fruition in a couple of years, so they have the stuff that example I gave where they were just started producing, and they're, kind of starting to get that royalty stream. And then they have things that are a couple of years out that once the new wells start declining, those other properties will come online and they'll get that boost in royalty payments. And so when you're building a mineral fund, you want that time portfolio diversity in terms of when wells are going to get drilled over time, just to help provide that stable return. So, it really depends. You have to look at the bigger picture. You have to look at, again, timing wise, is this a good time regardless of where the property is located, or is the property located in a highly desirable area that despite there not being new wells recently drilled, it could still demand a good value.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And, I think that gets a bit complicated for mineral owners too, because again, we're always prone to think, hey, we want to sell what is not producing and, keep the things that are giving those checks. And I know I had that thought early on, and it doesn't always work that way. This often works well when you need to change the type of income it is. Maybe the volatility is the problem. Maybe you want something more stable, like we talked about with rental properties, but you're really just converting wealth. And though folks get lucky, it's often not a time where you can go from something that, isn't producing anything now to selling off properties. And like you said, Matt, that the exception to that is those areas where it's really well developed. They know that there'll be development in the future. And that's hard for a mineral owner alone to know without kind of going through this process and working with experts.
Yeah. And one thing I will add is that, another consideration is that kind of concentration risk, is that you have maybe all of your minerals in one area and you have a lot, so you have a couple of different tracts and you have really large fractional ownership of the minerals. Maybe you own, a half of the minerals in an entire section or something, and you're highly dependent on that one section getting developed, and that, all your eggs in kind of in one basket. Maybe makes sense to diversify. Even if you like minerals and want to keep owning more of them, you could sell some in an area that's highly concentrated and spread it out into different geographic areas, whether that's different tracts in the same basin, or into different basins across the country that are maybe more gas mix or more oil mix. If you have more gas already, or if you had, all gas royalties, maybe you want to buy some oil royalties so you have that less exposure to the one commodity price. The other thing I will say is you hear the advice, never sell. And I think that's doing mineral and royalty owners a disservice, because then it just takes that option off the table when you have this highly valuable asset that may strategically make sense to sell some of it to diversify your portfolio. And when you sell, you do not have to sell 100% of your interest. You could sell a fraction of that. So that psychological barrier that you were kind of alluding to, Justin, that, hey, I don't want to sell the stuff that just started producing because I don't want to give up that income stream. Well, you could sell a portion of it. Maybe you sell half of the interest in those new wells, and you keep, the ability to benefit from the upside. If more wells get drilled in the future on that property, or if oil prices go up, you'll get that ability to benefit that while taking some of the chips off the table. So, just realize that you can sell a percentage. Any percentage of your minerals can be sold, and it just kind of depends on how much cash you need to generate as to what that might need to look like.
You said it, Matt. Somebody who is really looking into selling, and maybe I've decided, okay, yeah, I really want to look into divesting this. I think there's a couple of things that mineral owners go into it, and they often don't realize. One is the title work that's involved in doing a transaction like this, that there's tax implications that come with doing a sale of a property like this. And, what are the common things you hear from mineral owners? I think this happens both up front when you're selling the property, but then you can also, there's a bit of a gotcha when it comes to filing your taxes at the end of the year. If you don't have a basis for what that property was worth when it was sold, for them to tax you on the capital gains.
Yeah, that's a great point. So the way that you can manage capital gains taxes, because that will be something you'll have to deal with if you do sell mineral rights, is you have to consider what your basis is in that property, like Justin said. And what that means is, let's say you inherited this, at the date of death would be the time when you would get a value for that property. That would be your basis in those minerals. And so let's just give an example. Let's say that you inherited the property in 2015. At that time, the value was $100,000. You sold the property for $200,000 in 2025. The way that you would calculate capital gains tax would be to subtract the $200,000 proceeds that you received minus the $100,000 basis in that property. So you would pay capital gains taxes on the $100,000 difference. And it depends on your capital gains tax rate, based on your filing status and all of those things. But ultimately, that would be how you would calculate it, would be based on that value. If you didn't know the basis, you have to get an appraisal to get that done. It's a retrospective appraisal, or somebody today could look at that property and put their hat on as going back to 2015 and see what activity would have been going on, what was a likely development scenario based on what was known or knowable at that in 2015. And from there, they can come up with a value of that property that you could use, to be defensible if you got audited by the IRS. Those are very time consuming and not inexpensive to do. But if you have, the potential of saving tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes, it's well worth the effort. So that is a definite consideration. Capital gains taxes need to be considered. And then, like we alluded to before, to defer those capital gains taxes, you may be able to do a 1031 exchange. And it really depends on if you need to use that money that is generated, that lump sum of cash. If you need to use that for an immediate need, then this might not be an option. But if you have the ability to roll that into another investment that could maybe have a more stable income stream, then that could be something to consider. And again, the example I gave earlier, where you sell mineral rights and then you buy an investment property like a rental house or something like that. So yeah, those are some of the tax considerations you have to deal with.
You said it, Matt. And the other thing I think is worth considering as well is that depending on the deal, I've seen situations where the buyer does title work to get everything shored up. But I've also seen situations where there was a lot of title work to be done on, maybe it wasn't transferred properly from your ancestor or whatever else it was. But that's a factor that can certainly come in, and that may even be upfront work that you need to do to get this property ready to sell. I think people can be surprised by either they receive an offer and it's less than they expected because they're accounting for the title work on the other side, or they come back and say, we'd be interested, but we need marketable title, and here's what has to happen. On the buyer side, this is a business decision, and that they're looking into what this might cost and where it stands currently.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that will factor into how much they're willing to offer if they know there are title defects, which that will come up during the due diligence process. So there's a couple of episodes we did on investing, and it talks about the due diligence steps. So this would be from the seller's standpoint, what good to know what the buyer is going to have to go through to underwrite your deal and to do the due diligence. And a couple of examples would be episode 159, which is the guide to buying mineral rights. We had 160 was strategies for investing in mineral rights. And then we had episode 26, which is investing in mineral rights and royalties. So you can go back and listen to those. And we talk about the basic steps that are involved in underwriting a deal. And underwriting basically means the evaluation process for a potential buyer and what they're going to do in evaluating your property. And specifically, the steps involved are to run title, like Justin said, and they will identify, they do that to make sure you have marketable title, and that'll help identify if there does need to be some sort of title curative work that needs to get done. An example that's very common is that maybe the properties weren't properly transferred to the heirs when somebody passed away. Maybe they're still sitting in that person's name. If you do a search in the county records and the latest deed that shows up is in your great-grandfather's name, had been handed down to your parents and then to you, but ultimately didn't go through probate. You might need to have a determination of heirship proceeding or reopen probate and go through that process to get it transferred and to get marketable title before you can sell it. Now, all of that expense that goes with it is a negotiating point when you have a potential sale. So if you do know that there's potentially a title defect or that situation, you can use that and say, hey, I'll split the cost of clearing title and, whatever that needs to look like, and that would be something you could negotiate with the potential buyer to do. Doesn't mean that you have to do it before you can go and market it, but is something that will have to get done before you can close. And it will delay closing. So if you have the immediate need to sell, getting that process started would be beneficial because that is going to be on the critical path to being able to sell that property if there is a title defect.
You said it, Matt. And speaking of title defect, be sure and work with an attorney on selling any of the properties. There's been many situations, many things we've talked about over the years where you need to be able to clearly understand what those deeds are saying, what those documents say, and working with an attorney who can help you to ensure everything is as it should be and as you expected is really important. It takes one sentence, Matt, to sign away far more than what you were anticipating.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And an example of that is when they will take any royalties in suspense. And so if you're signing over any royalties in suspense, even prior to the effective date of the sale, that means if there's royalties that are sitting out there that you maybe don't even know about, that they have claim to that. And you basically have written that off and not gotten any value for it. So definitely get an attorney to help you review any deeds, or even before you sign the purchase and sale agreement, make sure you have an attorney review that, because there could be language in that PSA that will commit you to doing some things that maybe aren't beneficial to you in that whole sales process. So definitely get help.
You said it, Matt. And though it's not maybe an option to cash in on quick money from properties that aren't producing or in really great areas, but this is a valid way to navigate in life and to readjust your portfolio. And people's lives change, their needs change as the years go on. And so maybe, I know in West Texas, most people were raised to never sell, like you said, Matt, but that's not always the case. And this is an asset that was left and benefits you, and you should use it how you need to and what fits your family.
Yeah, absolutely. And, timing wise, I will say, like, strategically speaking, if you can avoid selling during a low commodity price environment, that would be ideal. So I know this was something you mentioned before we hit record that, you asked, well, is there a time when it's more beneficial to sell? And obviously, if price of oil is $100 per barrel, that's, the ideal time to sell your oil royalties, just because the price decks that are going to be used by buyers are going to be a little bit higher based on what the current commodity prices are. So if the prices are, near that $100 mark or something like that, they might be using $75 or $80 per barrel as the oil price that they're underwriting your deal on. And versus, right now when we're recording this is around $60 per barrel. Buyers may be only underwriting your property at like $50 because they need a little bit of a buffer, right? They need to be offering you based on a commodity price they feel is what the asset's going to average over the life of those wells. And so if the price is $60 today, they think, well, maybe it goes down to $50. I have a little bit of a buffer there that I'm not going to lose my money and not make my money back if prices stay low for longer than expected. So just know that you're giving up some of that upside from the oil price standpoint when you do sell, because the buyer is taking risk in terms of taking on that exposure to the oil and gas prices. And that's what they're paying for, is that upside. And so in exchange for that, they're going to be very conservative in underwriting the deal. And so you have to take that into account, because when you get that lump sum of cash when you sell, by definition, it's going to be less than, not including inflation and real terms, but the value in that lump sum of cash is going to be less than what you would have gotten if you'd held on to that property for the life. But just because of time value of money, they look at 20 years from now, what that future royalty payment is, they have to discount that back to today's dollar, at a 10, 15% discount rate. And so you're giving up that higher income stream potential, but then you get that fixed, lump sum today that you can then reinvest at a more steady rate. So that's the trade-off, and you have to be willing to understand that and to give that trade-off if you need to sell or if you want to sell, because that is what you're doing. And again, one way to mitigate some of that and give some upside potential is to only sell a portion of your interest in that property, because then you'd have any of that upside, but then you'd also be taking some of those chips off the table to mitigate the risk of prices crashing, and going through like another scenario where they're back in the $30 or $40 per barrel range, and your income from your royalties isn't helping to pay the bills. So there's that to consider from a timing standpoint. Commodity price timing and then development timing are the two biggest levers on value when you're looking to sell. And then the last thing I will say is that when you're looking at timing wise, if you have properties that's in a highly desirable area, so like an example is, let's say it's in the Delaware Basin, like Reeves County, Lee County, New Mexico, Eddy County, New Mexico, very desirable area. And if it's not leased, maybe you could lease it before you sell a portion of it. So if leasing isn't going to meet your capital needs, your cash flow injection needs, at least locking in and getting that lease bonus, before you sell would be good, because then you can take advantage of that additional bump and a little bit extra income that you maybe wouldn't get if you certainly when you sell, most of the buyers aren't going to factor that into the price they're willing to pay. They're going to look at it on a cash flow basis, irregardless of your leasing potential most of the time. So if they lease it, that's going to be how they make their money back quicker. And you may not get full value for that lease bonus. But if you do that, while you may be trying to maximize your lease bonus, just know that whatever royalty rate you agree to is going to directly affect how much that property is worth. And by example, if you were to just say, hey, give me the biggest lease bonus possible, I'll take a 12.5% royalty. I don't care. I'm selling this thing. You've just immediately took half the value of that property off the table, because the amount of royalties that property would have paid out would be half as if you had leased it at 25% royalty, just by definition, right? 25% is twice the 12.5% royalty. So be very careful when you do that. You have to still take into consideration the need to get as high a royalty rate as possible, because that'll have a direct impact on how much that property is worth.
You said it, man. We mentioned at the beginning of the show, maybe the property values are inflated, but you're not receiving any cash flow. And that is a real situation that you can find yourself in. So I think it's worth mentioning that the property values for these properties do impact this decision. And, Matt, you could speak better if it impacts the actual price of the property for a buyer, but it certainly could impact what your portfolio says it's worth. But again, if there's not cash flow there, then that could put you in a challenging situation where the property is worth something, and that might make it more advantageous to sell. Or Matt, it's not like we haven't heard before where folks have gone to the county and had them reassess property values because something was not quite right. And so those are all options that you can look at, but there is certainly that side of it as well in this equation.
Yeah, there's lots of different implications, I would say, from selling, or just the value of the property in and of itself, and whether you need to sell and the timing of that relative to different life events, or maybe looking at, like we talked about before we hit record, if you're looking to apply for Medicaid, they look at the value of all your assets, even the stuff that's not generating cash flow. And so they'll look at your minerals, and you may need an appraisal to be able to justify or to demonstrate what the value is. And there's definitely considerations for that. And, again, getting with your advisors to get specific advice is really the best way to go there. But Justin, do you want to talk about, okay, so let's say we've identified the property that we feel is the best for potentially selling. How do we go about gauging the market, seeing if there's interest in this property, identifying qualified buyers that are going to actually be able to offer a reasonable purchase price, and that are going to be able to come to the table and close the transaction? Like, how do we find reputable buyers, and who's looking at these areas and who's interested in these areas versus other areas?
Matt, this is an interesting one, because most people go into this with the perspective of buying a home and kind of expect this to be a similar process, but it's certainly not. And one of the ways that you can go in, you want to kind of, if it's in an active area, your hope is to find folks in that area who are active. And you can do that by looking at the county records. You're going to see different documents for operators and other people. Those would be wonderful people to contact. Matt, from a oil and gas company perspective, they kind of target these certain areas, and royalty companies are the same. But they're really, they focus each year, each quarter, whatever they're doing, on these certain areas that they're looking to buy in. And so when you do this outreach, you can pretty quickly gauge, once you've done it for a while, whether they would even be interested in that area or not. And you certainly want to get multiple offers. Another great thing is working with an oil and gas attorney in that area. They're likely to know who would or would not be interested. And then, Matt, there's also places like EnergyNet. It's an option that you could look at. If somebody came to you, Matt, and they had a non-producing property versus a producing property, would you guide them differently on how they went about selling that property?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where that property is located. So I've helped clients sell non-producing minerals in very desirable areas. In the Permian Basin is a great example of that, where you're still going to get in the, say, $5,000 to $10,000 per net royalty acre or more. And maybe you could have gotten twice or three times that if the property had a bunch of wells that were just permitted and drilled. But, there is a significant amount of value there that you could still take advantage of. There's still buyers that are going to be willing to purchase the property because there is maybe not direct line of sight to development, but there's indirect line of sight to future development just because it's adjacent to other horizontal drilling. The geology is good. It's in a very highly desirable area that has a lot of drilling activity. So it's just going to be a matter of time, so to speak, before that property is drilled. Other areas where, maybe it's in an okay county, and I don't mean Oklahoma, although the one example I have is I helped a client earlier this year sell some minerals in Oklahoma that were effectively goat pasture is what the term is. In other words, there really is no horizontal drilling going on nearby. There may have been some conventional drilling in the past, but that has stopped. And you're really just looking at someone to speculate on the property and buy it for a low price and hope that something happens, that they can either lease it again in the future or that a well gets drilled. And in that situation, you're probably only looking at a couple $100 per net acre in terms of value. So that would be a situation where if you don't need to sell, probably don't sell because you're not going to get a whole lot for it. You might just hold on to it, and then your kids or grandkids could benefit from the upside if a well gets drilled, and you have that generational connection, that connection to those minerals that you can pass them down. So it really just depends. But yeah, if you're in a very highly desirable area, non-producing minerals can be very still get a lot of attention and generate a lot of interest just because it's in such a great area. But again, when you identify those buyers, looking in the county records to see who's recorded mineral deeds in the past, 6 to 12 months, you can identify the list of companies that have bought in the past in that county or in that specific township or area. And then what you would need to do is do the due diligence and do the research on each of those companies to understand what their business model is. In other words, are they an end buyer that is maybe a private equity-backed mineral fund that is interested in areas where there's line of sight to development? So in that scenario we gave at the beginning where you had a property that had wells just drilled, you can very easily find a buyer for that property because it's highly desirable. It's got a very predictable income stream associated with it. And so there's going to be a lot of interest. If you're looking at mineral funds, they have to mix those, recently developed properties with those that are still 5 years out, maybe. So they might be willing to pay close to fair market value for that property because they're able to hold on and mix it in with the overall portfolio that they have. And it's going to be part of their strategy that they can continue to generate a return for their limited partners to meet those targets. And that's all a consideration. But I think definitely looking for those reputable end buyers as the target market for this, as well as if you have any wells that are producing, contact the operator, talk to their land department. They might be willing to purchase the property as well. So that might be another option. And that could be a very quick and easy transaction if they, are interested because they've already got the title work done. They have a title opinion before they drilled the wells. They know how much you own. They can quickly evaluate it and hopefully make you an offer. So yeah, I would say just finding buyers, doing the research, and then like you said, Justin, some properties might lend themselves better to Energy Net. The fact is that you're going to pay significant commission to an auction site, like multiple percentages, say 6 to 10%, for listing it. And in order to get exposure to more buyers, there's a trade-off for that. And you might have less sophisticated buyers that kind of overpay for things. And so there's a potential there. Although I would say doing it on your own or getting help from somebody that is tied into a network of people they can just pick up the phone and say, hey, I've got like half a dozen people I know in that area that are buying, that we can, market this to and get you, get the best dollar for it. And then also, having to pay an arm and a leg in the commission, it'd be a lot lower commission rate. And that's kind of what I do from the advisory side of things is do that for a fixed percentage. So yeah, it's definitely, there's lots of options out there. You can go to your own and do the for sale by owner option, but then you really having that network of advisors to help you, getting an appraisal done, or getting a high level valuation done to understand what it's worth, to help you negotiate, having your attorney review any contracts or deeds before signing, and then having somebody help you through closing to make sure that, you get paid before you hand over that signed deed.
You said it, Matt. Yeah, it's a process in and of its own, and it's certainly something that is on the table and should be considered when life changes and when it makes sense for you. But certainly, it helps to have those experts surrounded and to work with somebody who's done this and has those contacts to help you through the process.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. Hopefully, this is helpful if you're considering selling or have ever considered selling, but you've always heard the advice: never sell. I think it's more nuanced than that, and really need to take a look at the bigger picture. But hopefully, this gives you some food for thought, and if you're going through this process yourself. So, thanks again for listening. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.